Welcome to another episode of Patterns and Stories. Joining us today is Philipp Krause, an international expert in public finance and public administration, professor, and author. He has advised more than 25 governments worldwide on strengthening public management, budgeting, and fiscal governance. We are your hosts, Luca Delana and Ismail Manik. A quick note, Philip and Ismail often use the acronym PFM, which stands for Public Finance Management, the systematic process by which governments plan, execute, monitor, and control their financial resources to deliver public services and achieve policy objectives. It encompasses the entire cycle of how public money flows through government systems, from revenue collection through taxes and other sources to budget preparation and approval, expenditure execution, accounting and reporting, and final audit and evaluation.
Hello, Philip. Welcome to our podcast, Patterns and Stories. You have recently, with Richard Allen, published a new book on PFM. And I have here one of the older books, which you will probably know, which was kind of a Bible on PFM. So maybe if you could briefly discuss a little bit the recent publication and how it is different from the earlier some of these books.
Sure, and thanks for having me. I think there are different ways that you can answer this question, of course. The first one is that there was a batch of relatively high-profile publications that came out sort of around the start of the last decade. In 2012, 2014, 2013, you held the PFM handbook in your hands right now. There was another fairly substantial publication that came out from the IMF that had a long introduction by Alan Schick that was finished and published around the same time. There's been a lot of stuff that has happened since then. And we were particularly looking at the handbook and thinking most of the research that went into the handbook was work that was done sort of right after the great financial crisis and covers developments up until, 2010, 2011-ish. Doesn't cover the euro crisis, doesn't really get into the full implications of the great financial crisis, nor any of the things that happened since. And so in a lot of ways, it just feels a bit dated at this point. At the same time, there's, of course, you can ask yourself that question, I think, every 5 years. Wouldn't it be nice to have an update on where the state of play is with public financial management globally? And the reason why people are not doing it every 5 years is that it's just an enormous amount of work. And so we decided in this instance to not redo the handbook with its full set of 35 chapters, because it just felt like that was too much work for the potential gain, really, and instead focus on a dozen chapters, i.e. a dozen issues where we felt ex ante that these are either topics that are particularly affected by the developments of the last 15 years, or topics where, for their own reasons or by their own logic, just a lot of things have happened. And then we do like a more modest update, let's say, which is why we went with this framing of contemporary issues in PFM, the idea being that this is not going to be a full restatement of the canon, is not trying to do that. But for those who are interested in it, of course, each of the chapters then, covers a fair bit of ground and is not just picking up where things left off in 2010, but tries to look at the most relevant issues for our times, given where the discussion now stands.
Thank you, Philip. Can you just give us a brief overview of what's public financial management and the core issues that you're covering in your book?
Right. So this is a question that if you ask different people, you're going to get very different answers. Our shorthand definition would be public financial management covers the institutions broadly defined that govern the use of public finances. That is to say, the money that is going into the public sector, the money that is coming out of the public sector, and everything that happens in that black box in between. And we are using a deliberately, and I think after some debate in the field, everyone has sort of settled on saying we're looking at the institutions of PFM as opposed to merely, quote unquote, the systems and instruments of PFM. And so by institutions, then we would also include the broader political environment of how a PFM system operates, the formal and informal norms and rules and laws and regulations and so on that govern the public financial management process, and then covers every stage of the budget cycle, as it were, from setting policies and priorities, preparing the budget, deciding, approving the budget, executing the budget, and following up on the budget.
Within the context of PFM, one of the debates that I think you cover in your recent book as well about getting to basics. And I think you have also done a lot of work on competent ministries of finance. Can you try to relate about this aspect? What is a competent ministry of finance or treasury, and in light of, if you look at the basics?
Right. As a statement, it's one of those things that if you go around and you speak to people who work on PFM professionally on an international level or on a domestic level, and you're saying you should get the basics right before you move on to more advanced things, and you should really be sure that you've got the basics right before you spend time on the more advanced things, almost everyone is going to agree as a matter of principle. However, once you get down to defining what exactly are the basics and what exactly are the advanced things, with the implication explicitly or implicitly that the stuff that is advanced you can kind of sort of do without, at least for the time being, for a certain period of time. The basics, those are the things that you must cover. And it's impossible to define it at that level. And the discussion, if you look at the back and forth, this was a lively debate in the aughts, in the 2000s, where there were pieces that were published on the platform approach, basics versus advanced, inputs first and then outputs and so on. Virtually nothing that was written after 2010 or 2012 or thereabouts in the last 12, 15 years. And I think this partly from exhaustion, because it just felt like arguing over how many angels can dance on the head of a pin, like which exact accounting function is basic and what's advanced. Do you include, is the supreme audit institution that does its job well, is that a basic function or is it an advanced function? Is some basic compliance audit, is that enough? Do you have to have value for money in the mix as well? And so on and so forth. And so I think when you look at the whole PFM system, it's very, very hard. And I think by and large, the PFM community nowadays has sort of given up on coming up with something that is very, very specific. And our attempts in the book to revisit that question sort of, I think, lands in a similar space of saying, there's some areas that we can agree on that are definitely more basic than others. And at a certain point, it's just a wasted effort to go much beyond that. If you apply all of that to the organization and the role of the Ministry of Finance, it seems to me that things become slightly easier. Because then what you're really asking is, what is the core mandate of the Ministry of Finance? The thing that it cannot do without? And what are the things that in a pinch you could let lie for a while, you could allow that to be taken away from you in a political fight with other ministries, that if you had to dedicate a lot of resources to an emergency or a crisis in some areas, which are the things that you could allow to lie fallow for a bit, and so on and so forth. And there, I think it is really about having the systems and the people in place in the organization that would allow you to make a budget stick over a certain period of time. This is my personal understanding. Others would quibble with this, but that is sort of how I would frame it. And so why is this important? Because if you are saying that the budget that you adopt is one that is then reasonably credible, and I'm not saying that, it has to be 99.99% and there's never anything that can ever be changed, but that there's a reasonable expectation that the budget is the document that actually is the firmest and clearest statement of government policy. Because if you look into that, then for the next year or more or less, depending on your system, that is actually the clearest cut indication of what the government thinks is important by allocating funds to it. And once the Ministry of Finance has achieved that, and it's really not a trivial achievement and not something that you can take for granted, and is also not something that easily maps onto more modern and less modern systems, more advanced, richer countries, poorer countries, and so on and so forth. But once you have that ability that you can enforce the budget and you can be confident that the budget is credible, you need to have a certain forecasting capability so that you know that the numbers actually make sense that go into the budget. You need to have an administrative capability that allows you to shut down spending that is sort of unauthorized, that is trying to make end runs around the Ministry of Finance and so on. And then you can start having a conversation about what are the policy choices that we need to take this year and codify those in the form of the budget.
Thank you,
So one,
Philip. When you mention credibility, is it credibility within the government, like that other parts of the government will not try to change the budget? Is it with the other institutions? Is it with
Well, ultimately, all of the above. Because, but I would think of it as it's sort of a nested process, right? If first you would look at the credibility within the executive, as in that the other spending units, the other spending departments, ministries, whatever you call them, that they know that they need to negotiate with the Ministry of Finance. Because if there are too many ways around the Ministry of Finance, then almost by default, then the budget isn't quite as sticky as you want it to be. And it then becomes very difficult for the Ministry of Finance to set the terms of how those negotiations should happen. But of course, then draft budget goes to cabinet. There's an assumption that once the Ministry of Finance submits a budget to cabinet, that there then isn't a big fight in cabinet, because all of these things would have been settled. Most of those things would have been settled beforehand. You sort out the final handful of disagreements, and then it goes to the legislature, and then it's a different kind of a balance and a different kind of an argument that can then happen, a different politics, a different process by which approvals happen. And again, there are other things, of course, that are equally important. It's important for Parliament to be able to scrutinize the budget and perform its function, and that approval isn't a complete rubber stamp. But at the same time, if that balance gets out of kilter, apologies, too far, then spending departments would eventually work out that why do we even negotiate with the Ministry of Finance? We can just go to Congress or the Parliament and negotiate directly with them, because they are the ones who ultimately end up making these decisions. Whereas and there are plenty of examples of what that would look like. And then ultimately, yes, there are, of course, also other levels of government and so on. And then that annoying, pesky reality that as a group of people sitting in a government office, you can decide all sorts of things. But if the future doesn't agree with you, and if your predictions about future income, future expenditure don't make any sense in light of what is then actually happening, then it's all a little bit pointless.
There was an article that was in Financial Times today. It talks about the UK civil service and use of AI, and that it has been as a productivity tool based on a survey. And it also refers to another report by Alan Turing Institute that it says up to 41% of tasks across the public sector could be supported by AI. I think you cover a bit on digitization, and what are your thoughts on this and the future of PFM when AI kind of accelerates into these institutions?
Well, so there are a number of things I think that you would need to consider. What is interesting, if you're just talking about PF as in the PFM system, and let's just start from there. I thought it was really interesting looking at the work that was done for the digitization chap, Carl and James, who are the authors who've been working in that space and thinking about it for a really, really long time. If you read that chapter now, it has a very different tone to it and comes with a very different framing from what that would have looked like, I think, even 5 years ago, and definitely 10 years ago, where, a lot of us were still thinking about digitization essentially just as an acceleration of existing functions by automizing them, which in the PFM space is actually really relevant and has been an issue for a really long, probably 100 years. Because almost as soon as you had modern budget systems, there were people who were thinking about, well, can't we use punch cards to automate some of the data production and data collection for revenue processing and definitely revenue forecasting and so on in the 1920s and 1930s. And so that is a process and a development that has a lot of pedigree and a lot of history. The way that now we're thinking about government as platforms, the different ways that you can join together functions within the PFM system, the way that we are now thinking about payments, for instance, is just on a completely different level, where it's very appropriate for experts to get together and say, we need to think about digital PFM, digital government and digital public finance as a joined up issue in its own right, and that we are missing an essential component of this if we were just to look at the digitization of expenditure management, digitization of cash and payments, digitization of revenue collection, etc., etc. However, at the same time, I think we concluded our discussions on this book with a question mark on how long are we going to get away with not having essentially every chapter being a digital chapter in a book like this. So if we redid this volume in another 10 years' time, then would it really make sense to have a relatively, a recognizable sort of continuity discussion about treasury systems, for instance, in one place, and then a discussion about digitization of the PFM system in another place? In 2030, you would expect treasury systems and expenditure systems essentially to just look dramatically different from what they look like at the same time. Having said all that, I would also add maybe another note of caution here, that if you're talking about the civil service as a whole, it's easy to become slightly misled by all of the things that are included in that, right? Because there are functions in government that are sort of internal, transactional, where if you can perform them automatically, it would make things more efficient, and it wouldn't make a difference to people facing the government as beneficiaries, customers, pupils in schools, sick people who go to hospital, and so on and so forth. There's I'm sure, huge potential for efficiency in that area. That to me is very different from the areas of government that are actually sort of customer facing or citizen facing, where the gains and benefits that you would get there from having the ability to do things digitally as opposed to on paper, that's a whole different discussion. It's hard to imagine how you would change everything just completely in a very revolutionary way in areas such as schools, where you're thinking about the way that classes are being taught, the workload on teachers and administrators and so on. You're still going to want to see lots of teachers in school being in classrooms with children. That's a component that feels like it's a fairly essential element of what's going on there. And then the final element maybe to consider is, like, when you're looking at the top civil service, the policy making core that sits in national governments, in places like ministries of finance, for instance, I'd be a little bit cautious in predicting that AI is going to completely transform the way that their job is going to look like in the short term. Outside of a decade, who knows what's going to happen then? But I think in the short term there, I'm not really sure that that's an area of government where in any case we're looking for efficiency, because it affects relatively few people. And we're probably much more interested in the quality of decision making, the quality of the processes by which decisions are taken, and then the outcomes that ultimately results from those things. And there, I'd be a little bit more modest in what I would predict.
Yeah, the article was actually referring to the entire civil service, so it's a broader. One aspect with regard to budgeting, every now and then there's certain aspects become a bit of a fashion, or you could say. So one time the performance budgeting. So in terms of your coverage in the recent publication, I haven't read the chapter, but I don't see performance budgeting or this kind of outcome budgeting, or what is the latest on these in terms of the discussions within maybe the fund or the World Bank or in other organizations you are associated with regard to the budgeting reforms, or the what are the kind of popular these days?
So I'm going to start with the note of caution, I guess, which is that this is an edited volume, and we explicitly said in the beginning we don't want this to be a volume that is affiliated with any particular big international organization or any other international organization, that none of the authors are currently serving in active positions in at the OECD or the IMF or the World Bank, and that we asked our authors to strive for a measure of sort of comprehensiveness, but we did not ask them to not take a view, and we did not ask them to agree with all of the other authors, let alone with us. You are going to find differences in emphasis and definitely differences in judgment across the different chapters. My sense reading across the chapters is that there is the motivation that drove governments into performance budgeting and other forms of sort of budget reforms that were fashionable at one point or another in the last 15 years. Those motivations are still there, and therefore that debate continues on. At the same time, there's now a lot more evidence and a lot more systematic evidence available than there was in the early 2000s. And as a result of that, I don't think that there aren't that many voices left that would say, do A, B, C, D, and then your government is going to be sorted. Or to use, to paraphrase the debates of the 2010s, that do A, B, C, D, and then you have a reform plan, and 10 years later, any low-income country can have a budget system that looks like Denmark or New Zealand or whatever. Pick your model country. And similarly, there's then, I think, a lot less dogma, if that's the right word to use in this context, around if you do a budget, as in if you do a budget system and design a budget process, then these are the elements that must be in there. And so you must have a performance budget according to the following specifications. And if you don't, then you're doing it wrong. And if you do, then everything is going to be fine. And if you are doing it and everything is not fine, then it means that by definition, you must be doing it wrong. You are not trying it hard enough. Your commitment is lacking, and there are now too many countries, especially I think from that first generation of very enthusiastic reformers. And you can pick your region, really, and that includes the UK, Australia, and New Zealand, like your original new public management countries themselves, and they wouldn't sign up to this agenda in the same fashion anymore, because they now have 20 years, 25, 30 years of experience under their belts, and they realize, well, if we do this, it's just really not realistic because nobody uses that information. If we wanted to do performance indicators, then it has to be a few. It can't be a couple of thousand, the way that it was fashionable at some point, because nobody pays attention, and it's just a hell of a lot of work that is good for nothing. I think as a result of all of those things, those lessons learned, if you wanted to put a positive spin on it, the sort of the better grounded, better informed discussions that you're now having at a country level are discussions that are much more about, so how can we get better outcomes out of the budget that you have right now? Have you considered this option? Would it make sense, for instance, to do more spending reviews or to do any spending reviews? Would it make sense to capture a couple of performance targets across the board? Does it make sense to have benchmarks and so on without the same kind of rigor that then easily drifts into being unrealistic? That was definitely a part of the discussion back in the day, and I think now has kind of sort of moved on.
One aspect, because you're talking about outcomes, and one I think it is a bit outside the standard PFM literature, but this the delivery unit, the idea of that the Blair administration had implemented, and I think Malaysia and several other countries have also tried out. But the delivery unit doesn't, in the PFM literature, there isn't. I think the previous president of the World Bank, there was some support within the World Bank, and I think they started a delivery unit within the World Bank. I don't know the status of that. But this kind of reforms and PFM, is it that the PFM experts don't take them too seriously, or what are your thoughts on that?
So personally, I would always think about the experience with the PM's delivery unit in the UK as something that is quite specific to the context of the UK. I think you cannot understand why that came about if you weren't taking into consideration the particular dynamics between, Prime Minister Tony Blair, the Chancellor of the Exchequer Gordon Brown, and the politics between those two very, very senior heavyweight politicians and the sort of slightly competing centers of power within the executive that they represented, and where it sort of made sense for the Prime Minister's office to not just keep a tight leash on spending departments through these monitoring and following up on a set of priority objectives, but also keep a tight leash, or at least try to, on the Treasury, and make sure that the Treasury is not managing the budget in a way that is completely at odds with what the Prime Minister's office wants. And if you look at different countries, and if you look at the budget reforms or the public management reforms in different countries, I think it always makes sense to think about the politics, the executive politics in particular of the time, and the context in which these decisions are being taken. And so if you wanted to give a much shorter answer than the one that I just did, you would just say, well, how is a delivery unit different from having some kind of a performance element in the budget, where you're introducing a set of metrics, performance metrics, whether they're outcome or output or some other kind, and then link them to budget allocations to spending departments, and then use various processes of follow-up, supervision, accountability, whatever you want to call that, to track the delivery. Not a huge fan of that term. You could also just say the implementation uh, of programs against those targets. And so it's just one instance of a larger universe, whether you call that a delivery unit, or you call it a performance budget, or you call it whatever the thing might be called, some other thing that sits in the budget office and does much the same thing. It opens up a certain set of possibilities. It immediately also creates a certain set of perverse incentives that nowadays we are all well aware of, and they might all come with a half-life, as it were, where if circumstances change, if the leadership changes and so on, then those might have been the appropriate instrument to use at a certain point in time, and then stop being that 5 years or 10 years later.
Look, how you want.
Yes, thank you, Philip. Can you mention maybe a few examples of countries that have made interesting innovation in the direction of PFM, or some steps forward which you think are worth considering?
There are a lot of examples that are interesting, and what I find really difficult after having worked on PFM for a long time and having worked on this book now is that when somebody asks me, what are the key messages and the key themes from the book, I'm actually really struggling because there's just so much material in there, and there are sort of countervailing forces, as it were. Because there are some things that if you look at them now, they're sort of making you think, I really wish there had been more progress. Or if you had asked me in 2010, I would have definitely thought that there would have been more progress in 2025. And then there are other things where it's exactly the opposite. And so I think if you look at cash management systems, treasury and payment systems, then I think the way that a lot of countries have rolled out things like treasury single accounts, then um, I think that to me is one of those areas where I would have thought that it's difficult for political reasons often and has failed so many times. That would have been my summary, and you should be really careful about that. That would have been my view in 2010. In 2025, I'm sort of thinking, I think all of the technological challenges that were there at a certain point in time, they're all soluble. And it's one of those areas where technology, I think the introduction of different technologies enables different kinds of political and administrative dynamics whereby it's much more easily possible to sort of shut off unauthorized, slightly dodgy sources of expenditure leakage out of the government by having something like a TSA. And that has been working in countries like Nepal, for instance, and under great difficulty, even though the geography when this was done was hard. The technology was not always there to allow a sort of a seamless electronic system to be rolled out in, like mountain valleys high up in the Himalayas and so on and so forth. And that's definitely one area. I think just on this question of expenditure management and sort of payments and so on is, I think, the way that India has been working on the digitization of that part of the PFM system has now advanced to such a point where I think I wouldn't maybe say worst, most, but there are many countries in Europe that could benefit from technical assistance being provided basically by India on how did you do the digital stack, and what are the component elements? How did you do that in a system that is very heavily federalized across different layers of government, has a very, very intricate system of separated and joint and shared responsibilities between levels of government, and yet has made progress that, looking at this as a German, for instance, is definitely making me envious. I think, to a point where during it turned out that in Germany, it was not possible for Germany to make direct benefits payments to all citizens because the technical infrastructure for doing this just didn't exist. As in, you can pay benefits to all taxpayers, or you can increase the benefits to recipients who are signed up to, I don't know, unemployment through the unemployment system or the social protection system and so on. But it would have been impossible to just say everyone, COVID is happening right now, and we just want everyone to get a payment of 500 euros or 200 euros a month to compensate for any hardships that have existed. And so in Kenya, you could have done that. But in Germany, you couldn't have done that. And I think that teaches you, like, obviously, also in Kenya, you wouldn't have been able to reach 100% of the population, but enough so that was a viable policy option and a viable political option in times of crisis. And it took years and years and years. And I think only now in 2025 have the technical conditions been created for such a payment to go out. Theoretically, it's not like there is anything of that sort that is happening right now, but it sort of teaches you a lesson about, I think, be careful about the sense of superiority that you might sometimes be able to feel by virtue of just being somebody who lives in Europe.
One aspect, I think very important aspect, is the capacity building. We recently had a chat on our podcast with Shanta Devarajan. We discussed about Sri Lanka. in their case, with the crisis and the fund program had a lot of capacity building. And one perspective is the capacity building of the institutions, as well as in the civil service. In a lot of developing countries, you have very high turnover. And how do you kind of sustain the training of the staff as well as the building up of the institution at the same time? What are your thoughts on going forward in terms of sustainability of this continuous capacity building? And the other thing I should add is that now we have a major multilateral agencies out of the picture, USAID, which was quite involved in PFM in a lot of countries, including even in Maldives' case. So, what are your thoughts on this capacity building aspect?
Right. So my perspective on capacity building in PFM, firstly, is that my starting point would be to think of ministries of finance as government ministries first and foremost, which is to say that whatever it is that ails the senior civil service is going to be what ails the Ministry of Finance. And I wouldn't jump to easy conclusions about what exactly those problems are, in the sense that, yes, of course, you can always say, well, the salaries are so low and they are uncompetitive. But I would always go to the trouble of actually going into the ministry concerned and asking people, you know, are you thinking about leaving in the next 5 years? And if so, why? And what is it that is keeping you from having a career here? And then start to think about um, ways that you can crack those things that are pushing people out of the government. Because I think you would have to be very careful in a lot of countries that are lower middle income, upper middle income countries. If you include everything, the pension and the pay and the working conditions and so on, then yes, of course, you're going to earn better when you go into the private sector. And yes, of course, that's a problem that is more acute when you talk about a set of people who can go into banking as opposed to a set of people who have, not nearly as attractive a private sector sort of alternative based on their training and the skills that they pick up. But there are a lot of governments out there that are fairly competitive by their national standards. And so what drives people out of the government isn't necessarily just a question of pay. It might be that they think that their promotion prospects are poor because promotions are too politicized, or it might be that they feel that they haven't really got a whole lot of to do. It's an interesting training ground when you're at the beginning of your career and a nice thing to have on your CV, but then it actually becomes really boring after a while, because you are either somebody who is at the very top of the organization where you get to do all the cool stuff sitting in the office of the minister, or you spend 15, 20 years of your career doing just really boring, repetitive things, and you are not given a whole lot of autonomy to develop your skills or to do something that is meaningful, etc., etc. All of those things merit looking at. None of them, I think, are very particular to the Ministry of Finance, which often makes them more intractable, because you are then going to get the response, well, if we wanted to make changes here, essentially you are asking us to make changes to the entire civil service architecture of the country. And up to a point, that of course is true and has some merit to it, but I think you are always going to find other things that would be within your gift if you brought the leadership team of the ministry on your side and worked at that with a certain level of commitment. And those sets of civil service discretion, management questions, issues of promotion and so on, I would rate those very highly as ways of keeping people in the organization. Of course, if you look at different ministries of finance or different PFM sectors more broadly defined, there's always going to be training needs that are objectively there and that are important. I think you're going to be able to take care of them one way or the other. I highly doubt that there are many PFM systems that are going to sort of fall apart over the question of, have we trained enough people in whatever the latest budgeting technique is or not.
One final question I have is, if you look at these PIFA indicators. There is also PFM performance relates to other organizations as well, in the sense you have the parliamentary scrutiny as well as the audit institution. So what are your thoughts on what is the right balance in terms of capacity? If one of those institutions are not performing well, you could have a problem in the system. What about the interrelationships across these critical institutions for the overall performance of PFM?
Right. I agree with you. And I think that it's in the nature of budgeting or public financial management that it is an integrated process, right? That at the end of the day, the Ministry of Finance itself does not have the ability to directly control all that much of public spending. Actually, a vanishingly small proportion of public spending is going to fall under the direct control of the Ministry of Finance as an organization. Everything that the Ministry of Finance tries to do at the end of the day is to influence the way that other ministries that are actually in charge of the spending budgets are spending the money. And there are only so many things that I think you can do if the accountability only runs in one direction. And so there are good reasons why the budget system is so deeply integrated in the political decision-making process at the highest level. And so I think and therefore, of course, I wouldn't be able to give you an answer. Well, this organization is 50% and that one is only 20% and so on, because you probably want to look at it as a sort of in every country. If you look at that particular country and you're thinking of it as sort of an integrated system where things are moving and then at a certain point they're getting stuck or they're just points of failure in the system, then whatever fails first is going to be the most important thing. And I think if there's one thing that we are as sort of technocrats, which is, certainly that, I would apply that label to myself, because I've never looked at this from the position of somebody personally who has been voted into office and who's held political responsibility in that sense. For technocrats, I think there's always a temptation to think of the political system as something that is external and a little bit annoying at best. Don't often hear people talk about the amazing way that politicians are actually enabling the PFM system to function. And without the political system, there would be no PFM system sort of worth talking and thinking about, when in reality, that is, of course, exactly what it is. As in, for good reasons, you cannot depoliticize, and you cannot depoliticize public finances. That would be, as a thought experiment, fine. But in practical terms, it's a ridiculous thing to even contemplate. And so by extension, it's also very, very difficult to insulate a public finance system from developments that are happening in the larger political system. You can maybe protect the integrity of the administrative system from all sorts of external shocks, and that includes political shocks for a certain period of time. But if the political system is veering into a certain direction and that is sustained, then the administrative system eventually is going to follow. And it would be impossible to be otherwise contested. And that is also true for things for positive change as much as it is for negative change. But yeah, I would essentially look at it as a failure points investigation. You're sort of putting everything into your bathtub, and then you're looking where the bubble's coming out, and that is the point of failure that you want to start paying more attention to, whichever one it happens to be at any given point in time.
Luca, you want to?
Yes, thank you so much, Philip. As we're nearing the end of the podcast, there are two questions we ask all guests. One is, what is one topic that you wish you got the opportunity to talk about in podcasts or conferences, but somehow you never get the chance to?
Well, if this isn't going to be a super surprising thing. So if it's on topic, then I think I wish we spend more time talking about the history of different countries and how it relates to the PFM systems and how we are thinking about them today. If it is, let me just stop there. Otherwise, I'm just going to go completely off topic, and then that wouldn't be good for timekeeping. So that would be something that has been always a great interest for me. You can go back, whatever it is that you're looking at. If you're looking at macroeconomic management, I would always be curious to learn. This is a very sophisticated thing that we are doing on the macro side with the forecasting and the setting of numbers that go into the budget and thinking about outer years and so on and so forth. When did we actually start this? Which were the countries that started it? How did it become the thing that it is today? What are the dead ends that people encountered along the way and so on and so forth? And for me personally, I find it really hard to wrap my head around any new area or new topic if I'm not able to look up at least some of these sources to begin with, because then it just feels to me like I'm lacking too much of the context. I'm not really sure where this comes from and how it came to be what it is today. It can't just be whatever logic and justification we are applying to it in the present day. That would just be too easy and too simple. And I think it never is.
We also asked about some book recommendations on the topic, but let me ask this. If there was a new Minister of Finance appointed and you were asked to write a memo of advice to that finance minister, and also in terms of if he wanted to get a baseline assessment of the things, the tools he need to, would he be doing a PIFA assessment? Or in the book, in the last chapter, there is also a discussion of the World Bank project, it's called Boost. So this a lot of tools are there. What would you be telling in your memo to the new finance minister with regard to PFM? Also, he would want to know a baseline assessment. What are the tools? Or what would be your suggestions?
Sorry, I'm laughing because I was sitting in a job interview once for a job that I didn't get, where I was asked a version of that question, and it was very clear through several follow-up questions that the interviewer was just very keen that I would be able to give them the definitive answer to that question, and I was just very, very stubbornly refusing to give them an answer to that question. And I was just trying to think whether I would now run the risk of getting fired by you if I don't give you an answer and I sort of go back to a similar default. But when I was in situations like this in the past, and I think it was never quite so clear cut as, my phone doesn't ring when ministers of finance entering into office and they are not asking me this exact question on sort of day one of their appointment. I think it would be very interesting. So if any future minister of finance is listening to this afterwards, then you can find me on the internet. Please go ahead and do it. But I think I would always want to have a conversation with that person about what are the issues, the way that they see them. Where does the shoe really pinch? I've always found it very interesting in conversations with ministers or permanent secretaries or deputy ministers. If you are part of an analytical exercise of some sort or another, and you have a conversation with them, how many of them give you the feedback at the end of it? Nobody has ever asked me this question. Where does the shoe really pinch? You are looking at this ministry now. What at the end of your tenure, let's assume you managed to last 3 or 4 years. What is it that you really want to be able to get done here? And what is it that is sort of in the air about problems? What is in the political discussion at the moment about the things that are just, as the Minister of Finance, that thing is definitely going to land on my desk. I need to be able to get a handle on it. And it's not going to be 25 things. It's never 25 things. Nobody ever has 25 reform priorities. And depending on where those things then end up, that I think would send you off in different directions. If you did a PIFA assessment and that was the only thing that you did, then I would be very surprised if that gave you anything particularly useful by way of reform priorities. And I I doubt that anybody uses it that way. But if you knew that some of the areas that are covered well by PIFA, that's going to be a headache for you anyway, then you should definitely go ahead, because one of the things that you're getting from PIFA, at least, there's a lot of benchmarks, there's a lot of comparative data available now for the indicators that are solid. I don't think you have to go out and invent another indicator for budget credibility, for instance, because you just look at the PIFA data and what's there. But the fact that once you're at a certain point of basic capability, like we were thinking about that in the beginning, I can't think of many countries, high income countries or even upper middle income countries, that feel the need to do a PIFA assessment in order to figure out what's wrong or what needs improvement in their PFM system. If ignored your question earlier about what is going to happen now in a world where there's possibly going to be a lot less donor funding, and how is that going to change this landscape? And I think it's going to be almost inevitable that the pressure to do a lot of ex-ante analytical work that assesses the functionality of systems, that is now going to be less than it was before, because there's less funding, external funding, that goes into these government systems. And some of that is going to have a clear downside, as in the loss of information that is going to come with that is going to be a problem. And some of it is probably not going to be much missed by anyone, because richer countries are not using a lot of these assessments and tools. And there are other things, like if you look at the PIMA, for instance, that the IMF is doing on investment management, then there are a lot of PIMA assessments that are being done in high-income countries. And I'm assuming that that is the case because high-income countries, those governments are interested in the information that they are getting out of a PIMA. Nobody puts a gun to their head and says, you're not going to get funded if you don't do a PIMA assessment. I think that tells you something about the utility of those assessments, and is something worthy and valuable and something worth considering. And of course, all of this is going to pale in comparison to the very, very negative impact of a lot of the things that used to be funded from these external sources that are now going to go away. If I was a person whose children are now going to go unvaccinated, I would assume that I could do without somebody telling me, but now you're no longer aid dependent. Isn't that worth something? I wouldn't be sure. But that's a whole different topic. It's not a PFM talk.
Luca, you want to wrap up?
Yeah, no. Yeah, thank you so much. Oops.
Sorry,
Sorry.
what was didn't you say you had a second question? There were two questions.
Yeah, Ismail, you had a question about the books. You want still to.
Book recommended besides your but if you have any in this area, this very specialized area kind of.
Yes. So there's two things that I would recommend. The first one is, our book didn't talk about PFM reform very much. We are touching on the question of PFM reforms and the dynamics of PFM reforms in different chapters, but it wasn't really within scope, and deliberately so, because we felt that we would effectively try and bite off too much if we tried to do it justice. And so better to just be clear that just isn't going to be the focus here. And if you were more interested in PFM reforms and the dynamics of PFM reforms, there's a report that was done by a working group at NYU that came out in 2020, if I'm not mistaken, that was written by Alan Schick, Ed Hedger, and Nick Manning. I think is sort of the definitive piece on that question. If you wanted to look at a really, really good academic case study, then I think the book is called The Way the Money Goes by Christopher Hood, Maya King, and Barbara Piotrowska. They look at spending control at the Treasury, the UK Treasury, from the early 90s to 2015. I think, if during the rest of my career I was ever able to put my name to work like that, then I think that I would consider that to be a very, very proud professional achievement, as a sort of very solid, methodologically interesting, very deep dive one country case study into what has been going on in one country. I wish there were more of these things being written about other countries as well, rich countries, poor countries, and so on and so forth.
Thank you so much, Philip. It was really a
Welcome.
pleasure having you with us. Thank you so much.
Thanks very much.